This is the Development Locker podcast, and this is your weekly investment in your development as you continue your transition through life and academy football. In Season 3, we bring you even more episodes, more guests who you can connect with, and even more insight into individuals like you who have a similar experiences in pursuing a career in the professional game. Over the next 11 months and 48 episodes, we aim to cover the key topics you will face along your journey. From the challenges you will have to overcome, the ups, the downs, and many experiences along the way. We will be here every week to discuss the current issues in your lives, support you in your journey, and continue your development to being the best version of you in your interviews from the locker. We continue this month's theme of introducing you to new and alternative platforms. This week, we turn our focus to fitness, and we have the leading platform in this area. Football Fitness Federation have been connecting the world's leading sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches for a number of seasons now. In their networking events, free and paid content, as well as their podcast, they are the people to listen to when it comes to all things physical preparation. Ben Cartwright joined us to talk about the reasons behind its inception, trends in the fitness world of footballers, share key episodes of his podcast, and leave you with a lasting message to make sure your pre-season goes to plan in preparing towards the season ahead. One more week of pre-season ahead and one more interview from the locker. Welcome one and all to episode 2 of this season's podcast, and we have a really special guest with us today who is going to all things fitness at this important part of the season. And as we always do, we're going to get straight into the questions. So Ben, first question. Your platform you set up back in 2017, I believe, if that's correct. What were the reasons behind you setting up the Football Fitness Federation?
So Football Fitness Federation was actually started a few years before that. So we started the Twitter account back in 2014. And it was basically myself and another coach. We wanted to try and create a platform for coaches and players and alike, just to have a place for them to go to get the best information, essentially. So we started the Twitter just sharing some of the people that we respected in the industry and some of the information that we felt needed to be shared. And then the back end of 2018, it was a bit of a natural progression because we run networking events for coaches and practitioners, basically to connect with one another, have discussions, discuss trends going on in the industry, and hopefully create job opportunities as well. And then alongside that, we run like an online platform where at those events we have presenters. They give presentations on a number of different topics, and we recorded those presentations and put them online on a platform. So we had the two areas of the company running, and then there was a bit of a natural progression to start a podcast because it was like they were the platforms that we had already, but to get a bit of a bigger reach and reach out to more people, podcasts were obviously building, and it was something that I personally spent a lot of time doing, listening to different podcasts and learning from different podcasts. Yeah. So it was a bit of a natural progression. And I always say, Lee, as well, it's a bit of a selfish thing on my part because I get to speak to a hell of a lot of people that I wouldn't actually speak to otherwise. So we've done, as we record this, 195 podcasts are out there. There are probably 195 conversations or a few less that I probably wouldn't have had if I didn't have the podcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, you should have kept that one to yourself about the selfish reasons, because it's similar on this one. It is really good, isn't it, to connect and have conversations with like-minded individuals. So it's, that's another great one. And I'm sure from those 190 odd conversations that, when our listeners do tap into your podcast, they'll get plenty from each and every episode. I'm sure they will. And so we've talked about, mentioned it's pre-season, probably one of the most critical times of the season for academy players and young professionals who are predominantly our listeners. What's your opinion on the kind of trend, and it's probably going to be going for a few seasons now, of doing almost a pre-season, the one-to-one additional coaching? What's your personal and professional opinion on that current trend?
It's definitely a trend, like you say, at the moment, isn't it? And it's something that I've spoke to a hell of a lot of people about, including this week. Actually, I've had quite a lot of conversations about it. I think initially we've got to realise that there are sessions and programs and sort of blocks of training being done that are both done very well and also very poorly.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can group it all into one category and say that like private work or one-on-one work in the off season is either good or bad. I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. I think one main thing and one bit of feedback that I get from both the club side and also practitioners that have maybe been at clubs that have then gone into the private world is the transparency with clubs. So making sure that clubs are aware actually what's going on. So that player should not be going to a practitioner and doing work that the club don't know about. And I know some clubs are going to be more receptive than others, but I think the transparency is really important. The other thing with it as well is when I say it's done well and poorly in different situations, when it's done poorly, I think, to put it bluntly, I think it's for the benefit of the coach. You see a lot of stuff put out on social media where players are doing things that essentially, I think it's just to boost the coach's profile. And it's not necessarily got the player at the heart of the decisions that they're making with the program, which for me is wrong. Whereas when you look at other programs being done in that off-season period, the player is at the heart of every decision being made. And I think that is the critical thing behind it. If it's a period of time where players can work on things that they potentially can't work on throughout the season, and maybe the club don't have the capacity at that time of year to actually do that with the player, they then go and upskill in that time. I think that can be a really good use of time. But yeah, like I say, I think it can be done to different levels, and that is the main thing to consider, is actually what is going on at that time, staying in connection with the club or someone at the club, to making sure exactly they're aware of exactly what's going on in that period, and keeping the player at the heart of the decision. Because I think when I speak to people that are doing it well, they are looking at the player first, like ignoring everything else that is going on. They're looking at the player first and looking at how they can assist that player in that environment. And again, speaking to a lot of people in that sort of situation, a lot of it comes down to not necessarily the fancy stuff that can get posted all over social media. It's real key conversations that the player can take away and really benefit from for the rest of their careers. So it might be something around nutrition, around recovery, around their mindset, as well as doing the actual physical training. So I think there's more to it than just you see players being put through some grueling sessions, and I don't necessarily think that's the best use of the time and that environment and that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the physical aspect of it, because I was going to touch upon that on the next question. I mean, you do see it a lot on social media, so I totally get your point and your perspective of sometimes, and we're not generalising here, sometimes it can be of benefit of the coach, which it should always be the benefit of the player. But you hear a lot of people in the game, experts who have retired from the game, and they talk about the intense season, the duration of the season, the intensity of the game, the physical demands, and the reduction in their off time, as it were. But yet, conversely, you see quite a lot of individuals who are either promoting it or facilitating these sessions with players. So physically, is there a need for these players to be doing physical work before they go into pre-season, or is it counterproductive?
I think it depends on the physical work. because for me, I look at that period and I try and think throughout the season, players are obviously going through intense periods of fixtures, and they're not going to have as much time and available time to work on certain elements.
True.
And then that time that is freed up from the drop in fixtures, where you have maybe the off season is getting shorter now, isn't it, for players as well? But say you've got anything from a sort of 2 to 6 week period where a player might not be playing actual games, then that can be a real good opportunity to work on some things that player needs to work on, whether that's something around a previous injury, whether that's around a player getting stronger for the next season and improving strength, improving power, improving speed. I think they're all things that could potentially be worked on. The issue for me is when we're using that period, and I think this is what you're kind of getting at with the question as well, is that if we're working in that period and players are working at a similar sort of intensity that they're working at throughout the season and just doing conditioning drills, they're going to get that when they get into the pre-season period and when they get into the season anyway. So for me, that's just like repeating what's going on in the season. Whereas I feel like that period can be really utilized for working on other things that don't get prioritized, quite rightly so, I think, as well, at certain times, because the game has to be the priority. But throughout the season.
Oh yeah, I mean, I totally agree on that one, and kind of touching upon the point you made around the coaches themselves. Do you also feel, from a player perspective, that there seems to be this, again, trend, this need to be seen to be doing extra, to be obsessive with the game? So, you go back to the famous Stephen Gerrard interview of, I think it was like 3, maybe 5 seasons ago, where he was saying he was obsessed to be the best. Do you feel it potentially might be mentally counterproductive and certainly physically counterproductive for these young lads to think, oh, the pressure's on, I need to be, the hard work starts here slogan and the like, before pre-season, because they want to be impressing their coaches, their teammates, their agent, their parents, whoever it is they're looking to impress? Do you feel there's a pressure from a player perspective?
I do. And I think I kind of asked myself the question, and again, I've had a lot of conversations about this, on why players seek out that additional work. Because there's a lot of coaches in the game, particularly at clubs, that get quite disgruntled when their players will go and seek some extra individual work, because they'll see it as that the club provide what they need. But then I asked the question as to why is that player going seeking it? They obviously feel like they need something additional to go and do it. And whether that is to be seen to be doing extra, where I think there's probably some education that needs to be attached onto that more isn't always better.
Sure.
But also the individualization of training now in a team sport like football, I think, is becoming more apparent. You've got different types of players, different strengths, different weaknesses, different injury histories, different personality types. There's a lot of things that go into this team environment. We're dealing with individuals. And when you look at a squad, or you're dealing with a squad of, say, 20 plus players, and I know some clubs will be in there, especially from a sports science or strength conditioning perspective, there might only be 1, possibly 2 practitioners that are looking after that squad. You've got to question whether they can go into the detail that the players now want.
Great point.
I think the other thing with it is that obviously social media has highlighted the work that is now being done away from clubs. That might have been going on a few years ago before social media, but we never saw it, because it wasn't as easy to post an Instagram story of working with X player. Whereas now you see it, especially in these last few weeks, this off-season period, it's constantly being posted, and the sort of high-profile players are going doing it. So I think it's a tough one for players, because I agree, like, you don't want to train out the attitude of being the best that they can be. Obviously, that's what we want players to think like. That's what we want players to act like. But I think there needs to be an education piece around it. And for me, the best analogy is the spinning plate analogy. Like, we've got a lot of plates that we need to spin consistently. Sometimes plates are going to spin faster than others. we might get a plate starting to spin a little bit slower in that off-season period that then picks up in the season, and vice versa. And I think it's just important to educate players, like I said before, that more isn't always better, but clever work and efficient work at the right time will give you really good bang for your buck and really good results going out onto the pitch then, or going back into a pre-season period.
Yeah, no, they're all valid points, and I like how you've kind of really given a balanced opinion there, because I do know a few individuals who do offer those services as additional one-to-one coaching. I know them quite well, and I know that they'd always have the player at the forefront, at the core of everything that they design, everything that they implement and deliver. But like you said, there's also, like anything, whether it's agent, intermediaries, fitness trainers, coaches, whatever position, there's always good and bad. So it's a really good balanced opinion. I think the individualization of it, sometimes a lack of time, and just like you said, that education of having those conversations, realizing why is a player actually wanting to do more? Is it a lack of individualized work back at the academy or the club? Is it because they want to make improvements, they don't feel they've got the time to do that with the club staff? So it's a really interesting and a really balanced opinion that you've given. And I wanted to kind of move on now onto, in terms of pre-season, and it's unfortunately that time of the year where some lads will find themselves in between clubs, and from the return and release period at the end of last season. Have you got any kind of core pieces of advice, any easy wins in terms of their physical conditioning, where they don't feel they're able to either physically or financially commit to one-to-one coaching, but they feel that they need to be ready to go if and when that call comes, or if and when the opportunity comes at another club?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of actual programming of sessions, like day to day, week to week, it's hard to probably put across in a podcast. And again, without knowing players, getting the individual in mind, it's quite a tough one to give a broad recommendation of that. But what I would say is kind of what I've tapped into before is, yes, there is that period between clubs, and it's probably a point where a player is downhearted and not quite, and probably a bit uncertain in terms of what is going to happen next. But for me, it's also an opportunity. So it's an opportunity to kind of look at yourself as a player and look at those strengths and weaknesses and decide on the areas that you really want to drill down and upskill on it at that time. And it's not always a case of just bringing up weaknesses, I don't think either. I think we've talked before on the podcast about making your strength your super strength. So if your strength is, for example, your speed as a player, it's not a case of not working on that through that period and trying to improve your strength or something like that. It's actually a case of, right, can we keep working on this strength and really make it a super strength? So whether that is trying to get some game speed working, so tying it into some position specific stuff, or whether it is trying to be a little bit more explosive, or whatever it is at that time that they need, really taking advantage of that time. Because you just said, like, when you do get that opportunity, you don't want to be offered the opportunity and then be like, right, well, I need to now get myself ready for it. You've got to be offered the opportunity and be ready to go from that time. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but hopefully it gives a little bit of advice in that sort of situation.
No, I mean, and appreciate, visually you can't do that, and obviously you'd be giving a lot of information and content away for free. It's just more of maybe a takeaway message for them. And I think what you've hit that nail on the head with, looking at themselves, evaluating, analysing their own games, and listen to quite a number of your podcasts. That was the one key message that stood out for me, the super strengths. I don't think that's done enough. It is done. But I don't think it's done enough in terms of that. I think a lot of the time, I think we all do it, don't we? As a human being, we try to correct our weaknesses to build upon those and improve. But I think sometimes we often forget about what we're actually good at and continuing that, maintaining it, or if we can, like you said, making it a super strength. So no, I think you've more than answered that question. So I wouldn't worry on that one. In terms of then fitness in football, and we talked about trends before, and you'll be at the cutting edge and the forefront of, what the trends are out there. But are there any kind of misconceptions out there for those lads who are looking to do their own work, or for those lads who are engaging with one-to-one coaches? Any kind of, what's the biggest misconception at this current time in the world of fitness in football?
I think going into this pre-season period is that pre-season has to be gruesome. It has to be really, really tough. We have to be going through these really intense runs. And I mean, there's some stuff that's come out in social media recently of little insights into what certain clubs are doing. And I always try and take it with a pinch of salt, because I think it depends on the context. And without context, it's hard to make a proper decision. But I just think that this sort of side of pre-season, when coaches are getting players back together or a squad back together, time is still limited. I'm sure there's listeners that are in a full-time environment, maybe some that are in a part-time environment. If you're in a part-time environment, it's even more limited than a full-time. But even in a full-time environment, if you start working back from the actual time that is available to do the work, it still is limited to a degree when you've got games you've got to prioritize and all the rest of it. So every bit of work that gets done needs to be done with the highest amount of quality, but also the biggest transfer over to a game. So if it is just a case of doing weeks on weeks of just slogging players and doing these gruesome sessions and running drills, but then you're forgetting about the technical side of things, then you're heading into the first few preseason games and first few games of the season, and the players aren't looking maybe quite as sharp as what they should have done. Have we missed out on a big opportunity of actually doing some more football specific work? So I think that's just something that comes to mind straight away, is that pre-season is obviously a time where we are preparing for the season, but I think there's more to it now than just getting players fit. I think a few years ago it was different, because the off season was potentially longer, and also players didn't look after themselves as much. So they went into an off season and had a fair amount of time not doing any sort of fitness work. And you see it now, we've already spoke about it, but you see it now that players are keeping themselves fit. Yes, they are going away and they're having a good time and they're having a bit of a party and all the rest of it. But at the same time, they're keeping themselves fit. So they're coming back in a condition where it's much better than what it used to be a fair few years ago. So that could have been something that was arguably needed back then. But now I think it's more of a fine tune. It's more getting players' sharpness back, rather than having to build fitness from essentially zero, building it back up to being ready for games.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that point. Do you think that them being in tip-top condition for a long period of time and not having to have those brutal pre-seasons, do you think that will add years to their career, essentially?
I think potentially. It's I think people refer to it as like the 24/7 athlete now, where athletes and players are looking after themselves in a much better way. And there's obviously the exceptions still, but I think overall, if you broadly look at a lot of professional players now, they're looking at every area of sort of physical preparation and holistically, the sort of holistic approach to try and keep themselves fit and healthy as much as they can. And without knowing too much about the actual sort of real detailed science of people getting out of shape and getting back into shape, I think if you look at it just as a common sense, that surely it's going to be better for players to look after themselves year round. Yeah. In terms of longevity, obviously Ronaldo is the one that stands out, but he is an anomaly at the same time, isn't he? Like, I mean, he's an absolute, he's a rare breed. There's not too many Ronaldos out there, but we have to learn lessons from people like him. And I think all the preparation that goes on behind the scenes with someone like that, and many others as well, like there's a lot of the professionals now do as much as they can to keep themselves fit and healthy and available. And that is the big thing, isn't it? It's being available. It's being available for selection. And I think it can only be a positive.
Yeah, I mean to be selected, have that impact, and then it can only be a positive on your career. And speaking of careers and your career, kind of wanted to give you an opportunity now to showcase your podcast and ask you a couple of questions in relation to that. I mean, I've listened to not every episode, I'll be honest, but quite a few, and there's a few standout ones. But what's a standout one from your perspective? If you got a favourite episode, a favourite guest, a favourite moment or topic that you discussed on your 190 odd episodes?
It's really tough for me, this one, to try and narrow it down, but I've kind of thought of a few that would probably be reasonably relatable for your audience. And the first one is with Connor Washington, who's a Northern Ireland centre forward. I think he's just signed for Rotherham in this last in the off season. But Connor's someone who really values the strength conditioning, sports science side of things, and he's actually now upskilling himself and learning more about it. He also works with a one-on-one private coach, so obviously uses that side of things as well. So we spoke about that on the podcast. But the interesting thing for me in terms of the player perspective was we actually spoke about teammates, and not in particular teammates, but just in his opinion, like when you've got a more technical player in the squad that maybe doesn't rely on the physical side quite as much, how we actually go about speaking to that player around sort of strength conditioning, sports science, where it might be their attitude. I'm not saying this is every player that is technical, by the way, but it might be their attitude where it's not as much of a priority for them. So we had a really interesting discussion around that, and essentially we started speaking around the language that we use, and instead of speaking about getting stronger, getting faster, getting more powerful, it was more about what we've just touched on: being available, being robust enough to deal with 40 odd fixtures throughout a season where you can showcase your talents, and not being on the sideline. That then becomes more relatable to that player. Another one is, so that was episode 132 with Connor. Episode 180 was with two brilliant practitioners, Gareth Sanford and Damien Harper. And this one was really interesting for me because we actually spoke about the future of the game and how that will inform what we do and how we prepare. So I think everyone knows that the game's got faster, it's got more intense. You've seen this different style of plays from different coaches. And obviously that comes with slightly different demands on the player. So we had a discussion around what that would actually look like. And we were talking into the future as well, sort of 5-10 years time, where we think things are going and the trends where it's going to go. So we went into some specifics around what we think players need to be doing more of, potentially less of, to prepare themselves for the future. And then the other one I picked out, I've only picked 3. I could have picked a lot more, but the third one is episode 162 we called it the soccer combine. And this was my idea. I wanted to try and have a discussion around if we were to design a combine like the NFL combine, but for football, what would it look like? And this was more of a tongue-in-cheek episode. Like, it's not to say that we wanted that as part of the process. That wasn't the case at all. But it just gave an opportunity for us to discuss what testing is done at clubs, what monitoring is done at clubs, and the sort of rationale behind it. And then maybe if we were to then go on to design a combine style test, what it would look like. And there was the 2 guys that joined me on that one was actually Yuri Pagel, who's the head of strength at Ajax, and Dan Guzman, who at the time was a performance coach at LAFC in the MLS. And Dan's gone on now. I think he is still doing a little bit at LA, but he's also doing some private work as well. And those guys were absolutely brilliant, like really experienced. We had some great conversations, but it's also hopefully one of the most entertaining ones as well, because it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek at the end where we started designing the actual combine, but there's loads of takeaways in that one too. So yeah, I'd probably say those 3. There are plenty more, and I'd probably just give a very quick shout out to the latest one that's gone out, which is 195, and that's with Jonas Dodu, who I feel between Jonas and Stu McMillan, who's also been on the podcast, they're probably, if we're thinking about speed development for players, those guys are the best. And they're the best in terms of speed development, but also the best in terms of speed development for team sport athletes. And we've had some great feedback from Jonas's podcast already. And I do urge people to go and check it out. So whether you're a player or a coach, go and listen to it, because Jonas gives some absolutely incredible information. And what I would also say on that one is our audio goes out on Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, but watch it as well on YouTube.
Oh, okay. I didn't know it was on YouTube. Wow, that's good.
Yeah, we put them on YouTube, but and this is the reason really, because Jonas actually shows some video.
All right, brilliant.
It doesn't affect the audio because he talks through everything that he's showing on video, so it doesn't really affect if you do just listen to it. But I would urge people to go and watch it as well, because you do get a better sense of what he's going on about with the video.
Yeah, no, that's cracking. Like I said, we'll share your platform, your website, and the podcast on our website as well, so all our listeners will be able to tap into that if they don't already know where you're at. And the combine one's an interesting one. I would personally love to see that. So there's no tongue in cheek for me. I think that would be a great addition, whether it be a replacement. So the assessment trials every year that the League Football Education do, I feel that it could be an additional replacement, or certainly a future program to bring in, I think. And the fact that most football clubs now in the Premier League are owned by American owners. So yeah, you say tongue in cheek, but you never know. You might just be ahead of the curve on that one.
Maybe not the Lycra outfits that Yuri brought up that he wanted all players to be wearing, but
well, yeah, maybe not. But a bit of razzmatazz, a bit of LED lighting, and all the rest of it. I think that's the way the game's going. Maybe in American ownership and whatnot. But from a visual perspective, a showcase, and probably even maybe it's one to put out for the players where they feel that they would be able to better represent themselves than just in a football match, of to actually prove their range of fitness capabilities and whatnot. Yeah, it's maybe another podcast, that one. But so kind of moving on then, in terms of your podcast, you said beforehand that it was a kind of a, I'm guessing that was tongue in cheek, saying it was a bit of a selfish thing. Has it lived up to the expectations you thought doing the podcast? Has it been better than you thought, or has it been more challenging than you thought to produce 195 episodes in the time that you've had?
It's definitely a challenge to stay consistent with it and do all the things that sort of go on behind the scenes with it. But honestly, it's such an enjoyable thing to do when I'm having these conversations with people, and I learn so much. I ask a lot of guests that come onto the podcast what their approach to CPD or continual learning is. Yeah. And that's one of mine, because I get to have so many conversations with people, like I said before, that I wouldn't have normally. And these are people that are at the very, very top of their game as well. And also people that are in slightly different environments and scenarios, or working with slightly different groups of players, which there's always lessons for. So in terms of expectations, I probably didn't have too many expectations when I started it. But one thing that has been a bit of a lesson is that so many people are willing to give up their time to come and do it. Yeah. So the coaches and practitioners that we've had on it so far, when I started it, if you were to tell me that we'd have had all the people that we've had, I probably wouldn't have believed you, and sort of how easy it would have been to get them on. And that's the benefit for me, is that if I'd have contacted those people, and I'm not saying this in a negative light for them at all, because time is valuable and people are busy. If I'd have contacted people to say, oh, can we have a chat on the phone, then these conversations wouldn't have happened. Whereas having the platform and being able to put it out to people, and hopefully other people benefit from that conversation as well, then that has really been a huge benefit for me, and something that I've really enjoyed.
Well, you're going full circle, and I'm sure our listeners will be benefiting from this right now. So yeah, it's great that you've brought the podcast to the fore. You're definitely ahead of the curve, in terms of every man and his dog seems to have set up a podcast during lockdown and post pandemic as well. So yeah, you were one of the ones that I charted kind of my success in terms of how you design the episodes and all the rest of it. So from a personal thank you for me, but I'm sure many people out there, not just football players, like you said, coaches, those are in the fitness industry, the academy system, professional football, will have benefited from your many episodes. And yeah, just keep up the good work on that respect. In terms of then fitness and football, Some academy graduates will obviously not make the grade. Some will want to pursue an alternative career, and some will want to do that and still remain within the game. So in your experience of working, the many years that you have, what have been the many challenges for you in being able to get into those positions and be able to work within football, and B, what challenges have you faced once you've actually got there?
I think there's a lot of challenges from the sheer number of people that are coming out of degree programs. And I don't know the up-to-date numbers, but I'm pretty sure at one point you're talking tens of thousands of postgrads that are coming out of sports science degrees every year. And if you look at that compared to the jobs that are available, it simply doesn't match up. So that is the tough thing, the sort of availability of work. But the thing from my perspective with that in mind is that if it's something that you're wanting to pursue, you've got to look at those numbers and suddenly realize that you've got to stand out. There has to be something that makes you stand out from the crowd. And that now isn't just a degree. It isn't just a master's. It's maybe varied experiences that actually capture that employer's attention, and some skills that you can bring to that role as well, not just the skill of sports science or strength conditioning. So that's, in terms of challenges, I think that's an initial one. And I never want to speak about this in a negative light to put people off, because I think a lot of people do that, and I think it discourages people, and I don't think that's right. I think that there are a lot of good opportunities out there to work with brilliant clubs, brilliant players, brilliant coaches as well. And I think it's just looking internally to say, for me to get those opportunities, like, what am I going to do extra? How am I going to differ to the other people that have come through my degree program and all the other people that have come through all the other degree programs across the country at that time? The other issue, and this is being transparent and something that a lot of people have talked about, is the money in sports science and strength conditioning.
Yeah.
You compare it to a lot of other industries, and it's, unless you're getting in the top probably 5 to 10% of the roles that are available, it's not the highest paid job. So that needs to be something that you've got to consider from day one. And again, that's not something to be deterred by. It's something to sort of learn and maybe have a plan in place. I know
What do you feel is behind that then, the low salary? Because like you said, it's not just the case now where you've got to have a degree and you'll stand out by having a master's. They're almost like a prerequisite, a essential requirement to apply for that job. Never mind actually get to the interview stage or get the position. So what do you feel is behind that lack of funding, the poor salaries that clubs and academies are giving out there?
I think some of it is, and this is probably from our side as much as the club side, is showing the impact that you can make with players. And possibly, I'm not saying this for all clubs, by the way, but some clubs might undervalue what a sports scientist or a strength conditioning coach can do.
Yeah.
And when you compare it to like a physio, and again, I'm not saying physios should be paid what they're being paid. That's not the case at all. But they would prioritize having a physio over an S&C or a sports scientist because of the fact that they need it, because of obviously injuries and the sort of match day and all the rest of it. But my argument would be that if the clubs have got the funds and the availability, then you need your sports science and S&C as well to give the players the right preparation that they require to perform on a weekly or daily basis.
Sure.
So I think it's possibly that in some environments. I don't know the case in other environments, because you look at some clubs and you've definitely got the funds to pay more than what you're offering there. And you can see that through the wages they're paying players or other staff members, and they just simply don't put it out to sports science or S&C. So I wouldn't like to say why that is the case otherwise, but it's definitely something to be wary of. I know a lot of coaches that are working in good jobs that will have other sources of income as well. so it isn't their sole income from that role. And that kind of balances out that issue a little bit, because they can kind of have the best of both worlds from it, where they're able to earn a little bit extra from doing whatever it is they're doing, but they're also able to hold like this job that they want to do without worrying about taking too much salary from possibly something that isn't available and there.
Yeah, I mean, from an outsider looking in, what's also a frustration within football, and it doesn't even seem to be a trend, it seems to be a historical thing of not even showing what the salary is, and it can just being left till either the interview process or even as late as you getting offered that position. So you build up that excitement, you put in the hard yards, you're updating your CV, you're spending hours on getting that covering letter just right, filling in an additional application form, maybe going through a 3-stage interview process, and then it's only at the point when you get the phone call to say, well done, you've been successful, we'd like to offer you the position, do they then reveal what the salary is. And that's sometimes can be a massive letdown, and almost, not always, but almost from the people I've spoke with, it can be very demoralizing them actually second guess, is this the career for me? Of putting the hard yards of the degree, the masters, like you said, the varied experiences, sometimes a lot of the times working for free or for very low income expenses just to get those varied experiences, and then to be kind of given that massive blow at the end of saying, yes, it's going to be X amount of £1,000 that doesn't meet their expectation. I can imagine that's quite demoralizing.
Yeah, I think so. And then the other side of it is when the salaries are revealed, and we've seen some recently that are embarrassingly low.
Yeah.
When you consider what you've actually had to put into, and you've just referenced it there, actually even getting the interview, going for a degree, going for a master's, you're already talking that you're deep into a financial hole there. And then for you to then be earning like X amount, which probably only just covers your outgoings, for me just isn't quite right. But then at the same time, I feel like clubs can probably do it because they'll get applicants, because there's so many people wanting to be in these roles, which is a good thing. But then it does need to be addressed that coaches and practitioners are being paid what it's worth.
And then moving on then to, I'm a very big advocate of lads preparing for their career now, even if they're still playing. So that dual career kind of process. Do you feel starting to pursue a career in the fitness industry, strength and conditioning, in or outside of football, while they're still playing? And if so, how would you advocate that they go about even just making the smallest of steps towards making that happen while they're still playing?
I think just referencing back to the podcast I did with Connor, because that's essentially what he's doing.
Yeah.
I don't know whether he's got ambitions of actually going into S&C or sports science or anything like that, but he'll basically be in a position where he could do that. And I've had a lot of conversations with coaches that are now coaches that were players. And a lot of it stems through the interest of their careers and trying to really optimize what they're doing in terms of their preparation.
Yeah.
And then that then spirals into wanting to learn more about it. So I think personally that there's time that can be taken to upskill alongside playing, but obviously playing has to be the priority. You don't want to be doing anything that's going to disrupt the your performance week to week. But at the same time, I feel like there are things that you can be doing. So doing courses, even part-time courses where you don't have to put so many hours in a week. I think the debate around doing courses or degrees and things like that could probably be a whole different podcast. But I think starting in mind with it being around you and upskilling your knowledge around the physical development side for your game initially will teach you a hell of a lot. And then if that does then spiral into an interest, or you want to take that into a career, you're in a really good spot then, because you've not only got the knowledge, you've also got the the applied side or the practical side of actually trying stuff out and trying it on yourself and seeing how it actually feels. And that's something that I've had feedback from of a lot of these coaches that have previously played as well, is that they're able to really engage with their players now because they can talk about the feel of actually going through their career, or it might be something around recovery, like, oh, this really helped me because, you know, when you waking up in the morning, your legs feel battered, and I just did this little recovery routine. It always made me feel a little bit better. Give it a go. Like that sort of thing. I think it is really relatable for players. So I hope
it's not just that; it's also the context. What you were saying before. Then,
yeah,
I feel, and it's not about what you or I feel. It's about what the player wants and what their interests are and their passions and they want to pursue. But sometimes I do feel a lot of frustration because these lads have got a network of contacts that very few, if any, other individuals outside of sport would get. You or I, if you wanted to go into accountancy, finance, you'd have to kind of beg, borrow, steal to get your foot in the door. These lads are already there. They've got their foot in the door. They'll know at least one, if not five, different strength and conditioning coaches, if that's the line of career they want to go into from the current club. Whether that club's changed strength and conditioning coach, or has got a YDP, strength and conditioning coach, and a PDP and a first team one, whether they've been to other football clubs as a player themselves. You just think you can't buy those contacts, that network, to be able to get those experiences. They're at a very preferential stage, but yet sometimes they fail to tap into that.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really crucial, and that's why we have our networking events for coaches to build their network. And like you say, when players are playing, you could be at the same club and the coaches could change, and all of a sudden, if you think back through your career, you've played under 8, 9, 10 strength conditioning coaches, so you can draw from all their. And there'll be some that you relate to, some not quite so much, but that's always going to happen. That happens with technical coaches as well, I'm sure. But it's just learning lessons, isn't it? It's learning lessons of what has worked maybe better, what has not worked as well, and then taking that forward.
Oh, it is. 2 more questions to go, and we'll save the hardest one, the best one, till last. But the penultimate one, this is your chance now to kind of get your honest, frank, transparent opinion across at this time of the season. So many, if not all, academy players up and down the country and young professionals will be in the pre-season stage. What's the biggest bugbear from somebody in a sports science, strength and conditioning arena in terms of players' attitudes or lack of preparation or effort? What's the biggest bugbear that you see that some of our listeners could actually kind of get rid of, kind of tick off their list and give themselves the best opportunity to be prepared for the season ahead?
I suppose it comes back to like the buy-in side, doesn't it, from the player, that really recognizing why you're doing the work that is being put in front of you. But for me, I suppose the bugbear is from our side. And when I say our, I mean S&C coaches, sports scientists, because I feel like we can sell the benefits much better than what we do. And I think there's a lot of lessons, and whether people have, I'm going to talk about sales now on a podcast like this, but I think it's really important especially for practitioners to hear. And it's something I've spoke to a lot of people about, is learning from businesses and learning from salesmen, is that we are essentially trying to sell a program to a player, and not financially. I don't mean that money's changing hands. It's literally just about the attitude of getting a player to buy in. And if a player isn't and doesn't understand the real benefits, and they're sort of not putting the effort in and not prioritizing what they're doing, I think it falls back on the coach a little bit. In fact, not a little bit, take that out. I think it falls back on the coach, because we should be able to talk the language of the player to let them know how important it is. And then in turn, they should then be prioritizing things. And if they're not, it's either not being put across in the right way, or we're not necessarily talking the language of the player. And again, it sort of ties back in what I was saying about the conversation with Connor around the more technical style players that aren't relying more on the physical side. We have to try and find a way to work with individuals. And we've got a lot of different individuals within the squad setting. So I feel like that's probably one of the bugbears, is that it's a little bit of taking responsibility and dropping the ego and thinking that as soon as I step in the door in the gym, all players are going to listen to everything that I've said. And listen, I've been guilty of this, definitely, where this is the program we're going to do. Everyone's just going to crack on and do it, and they're going to understand why we're doing it. And it's not the case. Like, getting in there with the players is the first step of the ladder. Then you've got to then build the relationship, the trust, the respect.
Yeah.
And that then comes, that then ties in with the sort of attitude that players to have to the program.
Yeah, put perfectly. I mean, in terms of that, it's great that, again, you're taking that kind of ownership, that accountability. You know, you talk about the individualization of it again. And yeah, it's not just down to the players. It's always a collaborative effort, isn't it? In terms of, the hard sell. It's difficult. You know, from my background education, it's very difficult to sell what we're going to do, the reasons why we're going to do it. But what you just said equally, I think once you do, these lads do respect even more what you're doing, the reasons why you're doing it. And I think if you can get their input on certain aspects of it, there's also some non-negotiables, but certain aspects where they can have a choice. I think you just increase that buy-in, and then you just increase the impact that you have, and they benefit from that. And it's just, it's kind of ever evolving, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right with that as well. Like, it's not always a case of you just taking full responsibility all the time, and it's never an issue from the player's side. There are obviously situations where a player has to then take their responsibility as well, because you've given them the education, you've had the conversations, you've tried to build the relationship, but then they're still not prioritizing it. And I think that then does come down to the player. But I think overall, from our point of view, if we start with what we can control and going in with that mindset, I think it's much more healthy than sort of going in and thinking that all players are going to buy in from day one and there's going to be no issues with that.
True. And then the last question, I always think it's probably quite the hardest one. A lasting one message for our listeners to take away from yourself. It can be anything, can be, strength and conditioning related, sports science, attitude, life advice, career advice. What one lasting message would you want our listeners to take away from your episode?
I'd love to give like a really inspirational quote here and everyone like write it down and put my name next to it, but unfortunately it's not going to happen. But what I would say is, speaking to a lot of the people that I've spoke to, and not just the people that have come on the podcast, but the people I've been lucky to speak to at our networking events, and also players as well, is that for me, like, your attitude and the way you approach things is everything. And that carries over to any, like you've mentioned before about players that might not end up in the game in a few years' time. Regardless of where you end up, if you're building a good attitude and a good approach to everything that you do, I think it carries over to everything. And it doesn't matter whether you end up in football or even in sport in general. Like, if you're then going into a role at a company or whatever it is, then you're going to be successful. I think the other thing is, and again, this is for a coach and players, being coachable. So being sort of receptive to information that people are going to put out there, but also not being scared of questioning things. Because I actually really like, when I don't work with too many players now, but the ones I do work with, if they ask questions, I like that, because it shows that they're showing an interest. And that is, when I've talked about the education side before, that's kind of what you're doing by answering the questions. And it's exactly the same as a coach or a practitioner. Just because there's research out there, just because a club have done a certain thing in a certain way, don't feel like you can't question on, why did you actually do that at that time? Have you ever thought about doing it at this time? Because I feel like all that's going to do is open up a decent conversation where you're going to take a good bit of education off the back of it. So for me, they're a couple of things that I think are really important. The attitude that you put to everything. And I see, again, players and coaches that have got some incredible attitudes that literally, whether they end up in football or not, they're going to do well in life, because they approach things in such a good way, taking responsibility for things, being really positive and attacking things. And when challenges come up, like they always do, they're adaptable. They sort of take the sidestep and move on. And then not being scared of questioning things. I think it's one thing that I kind of wish I'd have done earlier on in my career a little bit more.
Okay.
Like you have the respect for coaches. I think that's a different thing, but I think asking questions is really important. And I mean, I've got 2 young boys now, and they ask questions on absolutely everything, and it's not quite the same. It's yeah, it can get a little bit on the annoying side. But
I was thinking that. Yeah, that's kind of a totally different spectrum, that one. But yeah.
Well, that's essentially what they're doing as well, isn't it? They're learning in questions on why we're doing this, why we're doing that. It's just if it gets repeated 100 times, it's a little bit different. But no, I think it's a really important thing for coaches and players. Ask questions, especially for players. Like ask your coaches questions on why you're doing that at that time, and they should, as a good quality practitioner, have an answer to that. And if they don't, like that's not great on the side of the coach. Like we should always have an answer for why we're doing that at that time.
Yeah, I can only echo that. I mean, I said something quite similar to the lads at the start of every single season when we take in a new intake of scholars. I actually love to be questioned because it makes me, like you saying, be a very good practitioner of, do I know the answers to it? And if I don't, I need to find the answers. Now, I'd like to think I know some of the answers. I'll never know all of them, but to go, look, this is the reason why we're doing it. And there's going to be multitude of reasons why. And, that's where you build up the rapport, the respect, and all the rest of it. I love to be questioned so that it drives me to think, right, I need to know why are we actually doing this? What's the purpose of it? What's the impact going to be, rather than just we're doing it because it's, we've all been in sessions and, whether it's education based, non-education based, a CPD session, we've all been in those where you've had death by PowerPoint and then it's just like, oh, right, yeah, that wasn't as great as I thought it was going to be. But yeah, I love to be questioned. I hope you'd like to be questioned on during this episode and sitting on the other side of the microphone. And I'm sure all our listeners will have got a great deal of information, a great deal of thought, a great deal of information to act upon off the back of my questions to you. So yeah, thanks for your time today, Ben. It's been very informative for me, but most importantly, I'm sure it will have been informative for our listeners.
No, thank you. It's been very strange being on this side of the mic, and I do prefer it on the other side, I've got to say. No, I really appreciate you asking me to come on, mate.
A pleasure. Thank you. How good was that, by the way? Ben is so balanced in his opinions, so experienced in the messages he gets across, just an all-round great guy who is working towards improving the physical work you listeners do on a season-by-season basis. Some key topics I hope you will take away. If you are to engage in additional one-to-one fitness or coaching work, make sure it's designed with you in mind. Specific, individualised, and that your academy or club are aware of this. In all physical work, not just the additional stuff, work on your strengths and not just your weaknesses. Build those super strengths Ben talked about, which could well be the difference in you getting that next registration, that contract, or even having a career at a professional level. Podcast-wise, be sure to check out episodes 132, 162, 180 and 195, which are all available on Spotify, Apple, Google and all major streaming services, as well as YouTube for those visual demonstrations. Thanks again for listening, and be sure to join us again next week when we bring you more interviews from the locker. Thanks for listening to this week's episode, and we hope you have taken many key messages away with you. But the next part is down to you now, by putting these into action. If you would like today's episode, feel free to tell us on our various social media platforms, where you can find us at thelocker_UK. For guest recommendations, future topics to be discussed, or you simply want to reach out, you can do so by emailing us on thedevelopmentlocker@gmail.co.uk. Remember to share this episode and our platform with your teammates, friends in football, or anyone you feel would benefit from it. So, what are you waiting for? But you're not done yet, as we look forward to seeing you next week when we bring you another interview from the locker.